Welcome to the Restorative Practice Summer Module. This is an introduction to restorative practice and will be expanded upon during August RA training. Restorative justice is a philosophy that focuses on relationships, obligations that exist based on community needs, and the responsibility to engage as a community to repair harms caused within those relationships. It's a philosophy that provides the basis for restorative practice work, which we use in residential life in a number of different ways.
As mentioned, restorative practices hinge on harms and needs, obligations, and engagement. So what that looks like in a community is that when there's been something that's happened where somebody has been wronged or negatively impacted, the first thing we try to look at is what harms really have been done and evaluate that based on the perspectives of both the responsible and impacted parties. And then from there, we identify what needs need to be fulfilled to move forward from the incident. From identifying those needs, we're able to decide what are the obligations that people need to focus on to move forward. And the nice thing about this approach is that there is engagement from all parties. So like I mentioned, both people who have been negatively impacted and people who have caused harm are really engaged in a very communal type way the whole way through the process.
This next slide is designed to show y'all that we're not just making all this stuff up. Restorative justice has a history in North America. Basically, the tenets of restorative justice can be traced back to several different cultures: Maori, Navajo, Central and East African. But a movement has been emerging lately in North America, and particularly the United States, since the 1970s, where it sort of resurged in popularity. This was led by a lot of folks who practice the Christian Mennonite faith. But it feeds in directly to the philosophy that we utilize here at Washington University in St. Louis. Another cool fact, in 1989, New Zealand made restorative justice the hub of its juvenile justice system. So anyone who is not considered an adult in New Zealand goes under a restorative approach to any kind of offense committed rather than one that follows the criminal justice path. Something we think is pretty cool. For this next slide, we're going to look at how restorative justice works a little bit differently from our traditional approach to criminal justice, which we're referring to as Western criminal justice. This slide demonstrates some of the core beliefs and tenets of each philosophy and approach to justice. On the left, you'll see criminal justice, some of the primary principles of criminal justice, and then the central questions that are asked in any incident that follows a criminal justice path. On the right, the same thing is there for restorative justice. But to illustrate this, we want to give you an example that sort of fits both. So for example, consider a similar crime committed in two different places. Think about a vandalized storefront in the middle of St. Louis versus a vandalized student storefront here on the campus at WashU. On the left, the vandalized storefront in St. Louis would probably be treated with the criminal justice approach. So in this case, it would be considered a violation of a law. Vandalism, destruction of property, something like that. This crime exists in isolation. The violator is either guilty or not guilty, and this person will get what they deserve. So the questions come into play. What laws have been broken? Who did it, and what do they deserve? Most likely in this case, fees, jail time, something like that. Now, if this were to happen in the same sense on Washington University's campus, over in the student storefronts, we would approach it a little bit differently. In this case, this is a violation of the community and of someone else's property, of someone and the relationship that exists between those two people, since they both are students here at WashU. The crime disrupts everything, not just the storefront or the person who owns it, but it disrupts the community as well, and it's treated as such. Instead of thinking about what they should be sentenced to or what they deserve, we think about who has been hurt and what are the needs in that case. So what obligations might arise from this? Rather than thinking of things like fees or fines and jail time, instead we're thinking about how can this person give back to the community in a way that restores faith in them and allows them to reintegrate into the community. An example of an obligation that might be created in this case would be someone doing community service in that storefront, maybe working for the storefront to either repair the damage by hand or to pay back in volunteer hours what they have taken away from the store owner. In that case, the relationship is restored and the damage is also repaired in the same fell swoop.
So now that we've covered the philosophy, pillars, and history of restorative justice, we're going to take a look at a video that depicts what restorative justice looks like when it's put into practice in a college setting. The following video shows an example from a real situation that occurred at Michigan State University.
To me, restorative justice is about respect. It's about community, interconnectedness, understanding that we're connected as individuals and as humans, and that within a conflict context, it's saying that we have an obligation to work through it together as respectful individuals so that both needs are met. And rather than trying to figure out how we punish the bad behavior out of people, we try to help people understand how their behavior affects everybody else and how do we all get along in our world. Currently, we have tried to ingrain the philosophy in what we do to get people to understand that this is how we want to relate to each other. This is how we want to care for each other. When needs arise between two people, we want to meet those needs. So that's kind of the philosophy that we've started with. But we've infused the restorative tools of using circles and conferences within a conflict context.
Restorative justice looks at things from all angles. Maybe both people feel like they've been harmed. You're really trying to see what are all the viewpoints from both. And I think the other thing that's really good about it is there's not a mediator who's trying to tell the involved parties what to do. They have to find their own solution.
And I really got interested in it more passionately when I began to experience the frustration of not having a model that would really truly help. Our traditional models of justice are passive. If I do wrong to you, it's somebody else's job to hold me accountable, and you're not a part of that process. But our traditional notions of discipline, in many ways, encourage people to not accept responsibility so that they can avoid sort of punishment, if you will.
Restorative justice is a process for resolving conflict. It is a way of being in the world. Here at MSU, we are expanding the use beyond just conduct to really get at some of those way of being kind of principles of respecting everybody, considering how each person's behavior affects others' behavior. And so we're kind of adopting it both for conduct, but then also from a community building standpoint.
I can honestly say it's effective because I had a conflict that I brought to the table with several students.
Two white males had a very large Confederate flag in their room, and 2 or 3 members from Black Caucus were walking down the hall, and they were greatly offended by that. They approached the resident director and said,
Shannon, we want to talk about this with these people. What can we do? And I said, have you thought about restorative justice? And they said, no, we didn't.
The director tried to explain that they have a right to display their flag, trying to help them understand the policy on campus, the whole issue of free speech and how we have to balance that in our community.
They got their supporters, and then the other side got their supporters too, the people who had the flag.
They talked about heritage and not necessarily understanding an African American's point of view about the Confederate flag, and the African American women not quite understanding the heritage piece, but hearing that from the men involved, I think was powerful on both sides to exchange and say it's a Confederate flag, but how it strikes them so very differently.
Each side had to sit down and listen. That was the biggest key. No one interrupted, no one went over anybody in terms of talking. They were able to hear all points of view.
They told very deep emotional stories about their ties to that symbol. And so it seemed as though both sides, if I could say, walked away with a greater understanding of each other's perspectives, which is a huge goal of restorative justice.
If someone's saying, I felt hurt because this was displayed, you can say, well, I hear what you're saying. What does that mean to you? Expand on that some more.
The men wanted to retain that part of their heritage, but agreed that perhaps a smaller Confederate flag could be displayed in their room instead.
We're in this digital age where a lot of our human connections are through phones, computers, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, we're having all of these sort of virtual connections. And restorative justice is face-to-face, and it's communication about sometimes difficult topics.
If restorative justice were used more in our everyday world or even in MSU or what have you, I think it would be so empowering to people that they wouldn't even know what they were doing, because they would be able to sit down and talk to someone in a way that's very appropriate and very respectful, and yet they'll walk out feeling like, oh my gosh, I had this resolved and I don't feel like I have to attack this person.
When a person does wrong to another and causes harm to someone else, to hear about that from the person themselves, to see the emotion that might be attached to it, there's some empathy, I think, that can result from that I believe is likely to be more successful at deterring and keeping someone from doing it again than just the threat of punishment.
I also think it's really important to understand that you may or may not need a facilitator with restorative justice. If you think about the principles, the 3 questions of what happened, who's been affected, and how do we make this right, 2 people can sit down on the spot and have that conversation.
Restorative practice fits well into the WashU community and WashU community values. Knowing students by name and story encourages us to get to know each other on a deeper level and recognize those relationships that exist between one another. It's been actively done for the last 4 years within residential life, starting in Thomas Elliott Residential College as a pilot program, and has now grown to where all of our RAs and RCDs are trained in restorative justice. And even more so now, it's become a campus-wide initiative. We use the term restorative practice here at Washington University when we talk about restorative justice. And it means that conflict is inevitable in any community, and restorative practice is based on the philosophy of restorative justice and provides a means to proactively and reactively deal with conflict.
Restorative practice at WashU is composed of both reactive and proactive methods. Proactive methods are focused upon building relationships and fostering community expectations. So those expectations can help when conflict occurs to refer back to expectations that you've set for one another. So those usually entail that's the community standards process and the roommate and suite agreement process. Reactive methods are what happens once conflict has already occurred. So these are methods to ensure that the conflict gets resolved and the relationships are built. So these entail the personal impact meetings, conflict coaching, mediations, informal conferences, formal conference, and community impact meetings. In August, you'll learn how to apply these methods, but right now we wanted to give you a brief overview of the processes. Thank you so much for paying attention to the module, and we'll see you in August.